Welcome, and Baruch Atah Adonai Eloheinu Melech HaOlam Asher Kitshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah.
Amen.
That I am going to start this share. So we were in the middle of a situation where this person, the owner, has been warned that his ox has now the designation of a goring ox. We had read that that means it has gored 3 times before, and I would assume also that it has to be done within the space of a certain period of time. And we had talked about how he was responsible, right? And it talked about how the ox was going to be stoned. And then it said, V'gam ba'alav yumat. And it says, and its owner too will be put to death. And we had an example. Rashi told us that the be put to death is bidei shamayim. It is not done through a human court. It is understood as being guilty before God, and God will handle that part of it. And then it proves it, right? It says, well, why do we say that? And it's because of a verse in Numbers where it says, Mot yumat hamakeh, rotseachu. It says, the one who does the injury shall be put to death, rotseachu. He is a murderer. And because it says he is a murderer, he's put to death because he is a murderer and not his property. His property, in other words, is ox. So you don't do it. And we're going to develop that further right now. So, im kofer yushat alav. It says, when indemnity is placed upon him, and I looked up the definition of indemnity, here we are. It's a duty to make good any loss, damage, or liability incurred by another. Indemnification refers to the actual act of compensating for such a loss or damage, right? So even though the word if, it usually means if, which sounds conditional, Rashi's going to clarify that. Our tradition does not understand that as conditional. It's understood as or as indemnity, or when indemnity is placed upon him, upon the owner of this ox, v'natan pidyon nafsheh. He will give the the redemption of his soul, kachol asher yushat alav, according to all that is placed upon him. In other words, whatever the court determines are the necessary compensations he has to give. He has a responsibility by Torah law to do this. Now, there's going to be some interesting stuff to unpack. So, for example, we have the im at the beginning of the sentence. Im kofer yushat alav. If an indemnity is assigned to him. Im, the word im, zeh, this particular case of the word im, does a no talui. It doesn't represent a condition. In other words, it doesn't mean if. In other words, a condition if. V'harehu kamo im kesef telveh. It's an example, another example of where the word im is not conditional, but is to be understood as when. And it means, and when you loan money, because there's a mitzvah to lend money to someone who requires it, especially, of course, someone who's impoverished. It's a duty to do this. So it doesn't mean if you happen to do it, it means when you do it. Lashon asher. It has more of a meaning of asher, in other words, in this case. Ze mishpato. This is its judgment, its justice, perhaps. Okay. This is its how it's to be adjudicated, right? Shiashitu alav beit din kofer. That is, that the beit din, the court, should assign a compensation to him. In other words, that he has to give compensation for the damage that his ox has done. V'natan pidyon nafsheh, and he shall give the redemption of his soul. Now the question is, who's the his here? And we're going to see that there's a classic disagreement between Rabbi Yishmael and Rabbi Akiva. They are certainly two interlocutors. And he says, Demei nizak divrei Rabbi Yishmael. Rabbi Yishmael holds that the nafsho, his soul, has to do with a person who was killed by the ox. In other words, however much that person's life is to be valued. Rabbi Akiva Omer Demei Mazik. Rabbi Akiva holds that this nafsho, the pidyon nafsho, has to do with the redemption from his soul, meaning the one who injured, meaning that he not be put to death. So that depends on how you want to go on this. And we have a reference here in Baba Kama. That's, as you know, the tractate in the Talmud that deals with many, many of these laws. Going on, Oven yigach ovat yigach, or a son it gores, meaning this habitually goring ox, or a daughter if it gores. Mishpat hazeh yaseh, according to this judgment, it shall be done to him. Okay. And of course, it's talking about how the case ultimately is to be adjudicated, meaning that compensation is calculated in this particular case, and that the person is held liable for the fact that he was warned that he owned property, that is, he owned an ox, specifically an animal that was known to be dangerous, and he didn't take the necessary precautions to prevent anyone from being injured, and in this case, the ox actually killed someone. So let's see if there's anything more here. I think we took care of it. Let's see. Yeah, or ben yiga, or a son it gores, ben shehu katan, meaning the reason why we're adding this here is we're saying it's a minor. It's referring to the fact that if the ox kills a minor child, it's treated as if it killed an adult, or bat, or a daughter, shehi ketana, also, that is a minor. And why lefish ne'emar? Why is the Torah going into this circumlocution? Shene'emar vehemit ish or isha, because the very first part that introduces this case talks about this ox killing a man or a woman. Yachol eino chayav ela al hagdolim. So we could argue, remember, this is arguing cases legally, right? Looking at legal issues here. So it could be that he's only held accountable regarding adults, that is, if this ox gored an adult. Talmud lomar o ben igach. So consequently, the scripture speaks about a son, etc., lechayev alaktanim, to make him accountable for minors, kegdolim, just as he is accountable for adults. So the case, it doesn't go to junior court. It stays in the adult court. That's how it's handled. So, im eved yigach hashor. However, if the ox gores a slave, or ama, or a maid servant, a maid slave, kesef shloshim shkalim yiten la'adonav, he has to pay 30 shekels to the master of the slave. V'hashor yisakel, and the ox will be stoned, in other words, killed. So no matter what, if it is a goring ox, we're seeing that if the ox kills a person, regardless of their status or their age or anything, ultimately the ox is going to be killed. It's not going to be left alone to possibly create more damage. Let's take a look. Im eved o ama, whether it's a male servant or a female servant, Kna'anim. Here we are talking about, again, we've mentioned the Eved Kna'ani. We're not talking about an Israelite slave or an Israelite that has been sold by the court to a fellow Israelite to work off a theft, etc. They're considered Canaanite slaves, and obviously they were living at a time when such practice was considered legal. Shloshim shakalim yitin. So the person who owns the ox has to pay the owner of the slave 30 shekels. Gzerat hakatuvhi. So it says, Rashi saying, this is simply a scriptural demand. There is no rationale given to this. It is simply the way the Torah commands us to handle this case. Bein shehu shaveh elef, whether the slave is worth 1,000 pieces zuz, sheish elef zuz, 1,000 zuz, bein she'eino shaveh ela dinar, or whether this slave is only worth 1 dinar. It doesn't make a difference. Shekel mishkalo, and Rashi tells us that the weight of the shekel, arba zeruvim, is 4 gold pieces, shehem chatzi unkia, which are a half an ounce, the mishkal hayashar, and I had to look this up, shel kolonia, and Svaria translates that as that is, so let's translate the whole thing here. Let's find it. Right. He says the shekel, its weight is 4 gold pieces that are a half an ounce of weight in correct weight in Cologne, in the city of Cologne. So that's that issue there with an ox. And now we have a different situation. V'chi yiftach ish bor, if a person opens up a pit. Now we know that a pit can also cause injury or even cause death, but it's not a moving item. It's something that's, of course, in the ground. But it's a different case, and so the Torah is going to discuss this as an independent case. So if a person opens up a pit, or ki re ish, or if a person digs a place here, bore a pit, v'lo yechasenu, but does not cover it. In other words, the open pit is a source of potential injury, and so the way it needs to be handled is it needs to be covered so that people or animals aren't going to fall into it. So he didn't cover this pit. V'nafal shama shor or chamor, and an ox or a donkey falls into it, falls into this pit. Rashi. Okay. Here we go. V'chi yiftach ishbor, and if a man opens a pit, shaya mechuseh v'galahu, that is to say, when it says he opens, it was covered and he took off the cover, right? He revealed the pit, took off the cover of the pit. O ki yichre, or if he digs. Lama ne'emar, but why do we need this second case of digging a pit? Im al hapticha chayav, if he's already held accountable for simply opening the pit, for exposing the pit, al hakriya lo kol shechen, wouldn't that absolutely apply to someone who digs it from the get-go? Wouldn't, if he's liable just for uncovering, certainly for digging the pit itself, wouldn't he be liable? Ella, but what's this coming to do? Lahavi chore achar koreh. It's coming to include someone who digs a pit after the pit has already been dug. In other words, who's digging the pit deeper, shehu chayav, that this second person who is digging further is going to be liable. V'lo yichasenu, okay, that's going on with the verse here, and he doesn't cover it. Ha'im kisahu, so we have to say that if he covered it, patur, and something falls into it, an ox or a person falls into it and dies, he is not held liable. He is patur, right? Because he took the necessary precautions to prevent injury. But we know that sometimes stuff happens. Stuff happens, and one can take all the necessary precautions, and nevertheless, something happens. The point here is that as long as he covered the pit, it's considered sufficient. Okay. And so what are we talking about here? Chofer Birshut Harabim. So we're talking about someone who dug a pit in the public domain. Diber Hakatuv. That is, this case, scripture is speaking about a case where someone dug a pit or had a pit in the public domain where people are likely to be. It's not in his private domain. In that case, the rules would be different, but we're trying to take into account all the possibilities that impinge on this particular law. Okay, shor or chamor. So we said that an ox or a donkey falls into this pit and dies, right, or whatever. Hu hadin lachol beima. This actually applies to any cattle, right? V'chaya, or wild animal. So this case of the open pit and the responsibility, it isn't only if an ox or a donkey falls into it, it's also any other animal falls into it that might be owned by someone else, right? And of course, this is simply emphasizing the fact that the Torah is not going to take the words of the Torah here literally, that our sages understood it to try and apply it to reality. So he says, because in every place where it uses this coupling of ox and donkey, anu lemedin oto shor, okay, we learn from this that ox is the ox, the shor, mi Shabbat, from the commandment regarding Shabbat. Shine'emar, because it says there in the Ten Commandments about Shabbat, Leman yanuach shorcha v'chamorcha. There it says, in order that your ox and your donkey rest. Ma lahalan, that's the end of his quote. Ma lahalan kol behema. And in that particular case, we say that it has to do with any kind of cattle, etc., v'chaya, or wild animal, kashor, okay, that it is all considered to be like the ox. Because we find in another place, and that is Deuteronomy 5:12, it says, V'chol behemtecha. It says, all your cattle. Afkan. So in talking about the Shabbat in Deuteronomy, I believe, the Ten Commandments, to be found in Deuteronomy, it doesn't necessarily talk about an ox and a donkey. It talks about all your cattle. So, kan. Okay, so afkan. So here too, kol behema v'chaya, right? That any cattle or wild animal, for sure, is going to be considered as the ox that's mentioned explicitly. Velo me'amar shor v'chamor, and the reason why it says both ox and donkey, ela shor velo adam, the point that it's making is that it's an ox and it isn't a human being. So when it mentions ox, it's not so much to say it has only an ox, but to say it's an ox, an animal, a domesticated or wild animal, as opposed to a human being. So, velo adam, and the reason why it says chamor, the reason why it talks about a donkey, velo kelim, it's not talking about chattels. It's not talking about vessels. In this case, if they are injured, etc. Going on, Baal HaChamor, Baal Habor, the owner of the pit, Yishalem, he has to pay. Kesef Yashiv Leva'alav, he will have to, and here it's stating very explicitly that we're talking about financial compensation, that he should pay back money to its owner. v'hamet yelo, and the carcass of the animal will be his, and that's going to have to be his is not exactly clear. So we're going to look at the Rashi and see if we can clarify all of this. So let's see. Make sure I got the right place here. Okay, here we go. It's just one word, right? Val Hashor, the owner of Baal Habor. Forgive me, I keep saying Baal Hashor, the owner of the pit, Baal Habor. Baal Hatakala. So it's talking about the one who actually owns this dangerous, potentially dangerous object, or that's in the ground. So takala is known as a snare, right? The owner of the snare or the trap, afal pi she'ein habor shelo, even though it says that even technically speaking, this pit is not his, she'asahu bershut harabim, because we already read that the Torah was talking about a situation where a person digs a pit in the public domain, and so it's not his, not this owner's. Asahu hakatuv ba'alav. Scripture imputes ownership to him. For what reason? Lehitchayev b'mezikin, to make him obligated to pay damages. Kesef yashiv leva'alav, he shall return money to the owner of the animal, right? Yashiv, and the reason why it says yashiv, he will return, l'rabot shaveh kesef. So the reason it doesn't just say kesef leva'alav, it says it's got this word yashiv, to return. So in other words, it's saying that it's not just money. It doesn't have to be just cash. It says shaveh kesef. In other words, anything equivalent that has the same value as the price that the court affixes regarding this particular ox. Va'afilu suvin, even if he gives him bran, okay. The main thing is if he gives him bran, it has to be the amount valued, the amount of money that the court has set for this. Going on. So it's interesting. This may not be Rashi, but it's someone like the Tosafot to see something in Rashi and feel a need to comment. And it says the fact that it's written in the Torah, Meitav Sadehu, it says the best of his field, the Katav Rashi, and so Rashi wrote, Shahanazikin min ha'idit. That is to say that compensation for damages, personal or otherwise damages, has to come from your best crops or the best fruit. Okay. Tiretz v'Gemara. So the Gemara tries to harmonize these two opinions. Okay. One is that in this particular case, in the case of the pit, the understanding is that he can pay back in kind, he can pay back in cash, but it doesn't have to just be cash. And it doesn't have to be the best property he has. Whereas there's a case where it talks about him having to return, having to compensate from his best products, his best produce. So the way the Gemara harmonizes this, Rav Huna Brei de Rav Yoshua, Rav Huna, the son of Rav Yoshua, the Perek Kama de Baba Kama, in the first chapter of Baba Kama. So what is it? Jezehu im ba legabot. I'm going to say that this particular case is that he's coming to demand compensation, karka, that is in terms of land. In other words, if the compensation is to be in land, right, it has to be from the best land he has, because we know that there's some land that might be rocky or maybe underwater or whatever, but he knows what part of his field produces the best produce. That's what he has to pay from it. Aval metaltale, but in a case where we're talking about chattels, we're talking about objects, kol mile meitavhu. So he's saying anything is appropriate for this. The ilo, Okay, sorry, it says, you're right. The ilo mizdavan hacha, because the point is that with chattels, if he can't sell them in this place, he can sell them in another place. Whereas with land, it's in one place only, and you have to depend on what people feel in that particular locale. But if you're not happy with the prices in one place, you can always take your chattels to another place and see if you can realize a better profit. V'hamet yelo, and the dead ox will be his, right? But the point is, right. The dead ox is the ox that the goring ox has killed. It shall be his. And this is a quote from Mechilta Baba Kama, from the Mechilta and Baba Kama, page 7. So the question is, what do we mean? Lanizak shamin et hanevela, to the one who was injured, they estimate shamin, they estimate the value of the carcass, venotla bedamim, and they take it in money, umishalem lo hamazik aleha, and the one who injured him pays him for it, tashlume nezek, the payment for the damages done. So we're going to see that when it comes, in this particular case, it's going to be full payment, because remember, we're talking about a well, and we'll see what they're talking about later. In the next verse, we'll develop this regarding here we go, an ox that gored another ox and killed it. So this is how we deal with the well, or the pit, right? That you have to figure out the value of the nevela, I believe. Yeah, let's take a look. Yes, that's what it's calculated to be, and that's how much he's paid in cash. Okay, so it's interesting that there's some, I suspect that part of the reason why it's the value of the carcass is that the animal, to some extent, is also the owner of the animal's responsibility too. And it's possible that they're striving for an equitable solution. Let me place the marker here, and we will continue this. Our next lesson will start here. And I'm going to stop the share. Before I close the recording, any comments for the record? Okay.